right, we are going to jump into nutrition now, looking at the effects of nutrition on cardiovascular disease. We'll focus a lot on anti-inflammatory type diets, such as the Mediterranean diet. We'll look at different individual components as well as those overall dietary patterns that can have an effect on either increasing or decreasing cardiovascular disease. So when we look at inflammatory diets, the diets that are high in refined sugars and starches, high in trans fats, low in omega-3 fats, low in antioxidants, and low in fiber from fruits and vegetables and whole grains. So generally, if people aren't eating enough plants, they're not going to get obviously enough antioxidants. If we're not eating any kind of fish or food sources of omega-3 fats, we're going to have some increase in inflammation typically. And of course, if we're eating lots of processed foods that are high in trans fats and refined sugars, we're going to increase inflammation. So here is a graphic from the Journal of the American College of Cardiology, and this one is just showing some of those pathways. With diet, we see, of course, the omega-3 fats. If we are low in those omega-3 fats, one of the reasons that it's increasing coronary heart disease or cardiovascular disease, but I guess coronary heart disease in particular, is that it's leading to endothelial dysfunction. And so if we have low fruits and vegetables and fiber, then we increase our risk of oxidizing that LDL, which gets trapped inside that artery wall and leads to those foam cells. And of course, that stimulates or increases the risk of coronary heart disease. And of course, if we have the increase in trans fats and high saturated fats, this can affect our cholesterol levels, increasing that LDL size and concentration. And of course, then this is going to increase our risk of coronary heart disease and cardiovascular disease in general. So looking at fatty acids, there's been quite a lot of research looking at fatty acids and inflammation. Some of the big studies, the Nurses' Health Study is a huge study. And in this particular study, they found that CRP was increased by 73% in the women that were consuming the highest amounts of these inflammatory trans fatty acids. We also found in this study, or they found, the researchers found, that IL-6 levels were increased by 17% in the people that were consuming the higher end of the trans fats compared to those consuming the lowest amounts. And what they found in addition was that these markers of endothelial activation, things like that E-selectin that we talked about, those adhesion molecules, tend to be increased as well in individuals that are consuming higher amounts of trans fats. So it's adversely affecting that endothelial function. And of course, trans fats just alter that basic metabolic pathway. They interfere with the cell membranes and they suppress certain immune responses in addition to increasing others. It's possible that body weight had some influence on what was seen in the Nurses' Health Study. Previous research has also seen trans fat intake increasing IL-6 and CRP, but it was in women that had higher body mass index. Another thing that was seen in this research was that the vegetarian diets appeared to have a positive effect in reducing C-reactive protein, more so compared to the participants that were omnivores. So the vegetarian diet, of course, typically being lower in saturated fats, lower in trans fats, and high in antioxidants. And that was one of the things that they saw was a higher antioxidant status in those subjects that were on the vegetarian diet, and a coronary heart disease risk profile that was improved compared to the omnivores. Now, of course, a vegetarian can have a horrible diet. I've analyzed diets and of vegetarians that were actually consuming very little fruits and vegetables, lots and lots of grain, but really sparse on the vegetables. And of course, if you're not getting the right amount of nutrients, then a vegetarian diet is not going to be a healthy option either. So we have to have a balanced diet either way. Some of the other things, of course, that we're seeing, we look at that arachidonic acid, which comes from, or that omega-6 fatty acids. The arachidonic acid that we get in from vegetable oils, high vegetable oil intake, as well as from consuming meat, particularly those meats that are also fed corn. But we see that the eicosanoids, of course, from arachidonic acid tend to be more inflammatory. They increase inflammation more. So we see greater pro-inflammatory cytokines like IL-1, tumor necrosis factor alpha, and IL-6. And we also see this omega-6 and omega-3 polyunsaturated fats. They actually compete with one another for the same metabolic pathway. So if we have more of the omega-6, they're going to win out, and we're not going to incorporate those omega-3 fats into the system as readily, and that can have an impact on a lot of different things. Just even that cell membrane, if we don't have enough of those omega-3s, it affects receptors, it affects the flexibility of the cell, so on and so on. When it comes to those refined carbs increasing inflammation, one of the other things that we see is that they increase triglycerides, and particularly when we look at fructose, because fructose is metabolized differently than other sugars like glucose. It can end up leading to elevated triglycerides and also even dyslipidemia. And so the National Heart and Lung and Blood Association, or Institute, I should say, they actually have recommended that particularly for those individuals that have elevated triglycerides, that they keep the carbohydrates lower. And they state that greater than 60% of total calories, they should definitely not be consuming more than that. And some others will state that lower intakes, 50% or less, would be important for individuals that have metabolic syndrome and who have elevated triglycerides and low HDL cholesterol. Some other factors that we want to consider when it comes to triglycerides, this is according to the American Heart Association, they recommend that we change many lifestyle habits. Some of those habits, of course, maintaining a healthy body weight. Even a 5 to 10% reduction in body weight can have a significant impact on so many aspects of our health, not just triglycerides. But a 20% decrease in triglycerides has been associated with just that 5 to 10% reduction in body weight. And we can look at saturated fats and trans fats as we've talked about, that increases inflammation, but we also see that the trans fats and saturated fats can lead to an increase in triglycerides. So we really want to monitor both the trans and the saturated fats. Limited carbs, refined carbs specifically, of course, we want to minimize those fructose containing carbohydrates because those can raise the triglycerides. And so really we're getting such high amounts of the fructose from things like soda and sweetened beverages. Omega-3s, of course, can increase if they're low, can lead to an increase. Or if you have high intake of omegas, it can lead to a decrease in triglyceride levels. We also want to focus on alcohol because alcohol has been shown to increase triglycerides as well in some people, not in everybody, but individuals with very high triglyceride levels should probably abstain from alcohol. The other thing, of course, we want to increase are fruits and vegetables, and the American Heart Association also recommends in consuming non-fat and low-fat dairy products as well. And of course, although we're talking about nutrition, physical activity is helpful in reducing those triglycerides as well. And substituting carbohydrates for fats is absolutely not a good idea for triglycerides. One of the things, of course, we saw back in the 80s was, everybody went low fat, everybody increased carbs. They displaced the fat content with the carbohydrates. And of course, we have so much of those carbs coming from refined sources. And we know that we need to absolutely not replace fats with carbs. We don't want too much carbs, and we certainly don't refine carbs because that, of course, raises triglycerides, but it also leads to that decrease in HDL in some people. So keeping the dietary fat around 25 to 35% of total calories is probably a good idea. Let's now talk about anti-inflammatory diets as opposed to the inflammatory diets. Of course, basically go the opposite direction and it'll probably be pretty good. If we just got rid of the processed garbage, we would be so far ahead in all of this. We just need to minimize that. Of course, a lot of that comes to those brain reward pathways. So we really need to bump up the joy in our lives and get that dopamine kick so that we can say no to the refined and processed foods. So, okay, anti-inflammatory diets. The Mediterranean diet has an enormous amount of research. I will post some studies or at least references for you if you want to dive deeper into that. I'll also post the website of the PrettyMed study. They have a ton of information on the website, from studies to recipes, both English and Spanish. I'm not sure if they have any other languages on there. I've only sent out English and Spanish. So anyway, this is the gist of it. Basically, it's eat lots of fruits and vegetables, eat a lot of plants, including high amounts of olive oil. And I'll give you specifics on this. Obviously, in this diagram from Old Ways, that has a lot of, it has some details on the number of servings, but I'll give you some real specifics that were based on the research. So, well, not that this wasn't based on the research, it is too, but it'll show you like exactly how much the subjects were consuming and how they monitored it. So, of course, again, every main meal, you want plants. You want fruits and vegetables, at least 2 servings of vegetables, they suggest, and 1 to 2 servings of fruit, olive oil at every meal, and then you can consume breads and grains, of course, not refined. You want whole grains. The second level there is to consume every day olives, nuts, seeds, 1 to 2 servings. Lots of herbs and spices, garlic and onions. All of these are not only loaded with vitamins and minerals, but obviously they're loaded with phytochemicals that are so protective and antioxidants. They list everyday dairy, 2 servings, preferably low fat. Again, that's what was in all the research. Weekly, they suggest meat 2 times or 2 servings. Fish is recommended or over at least 2 servings per week, which is pretty customary. We recommend about 3 servings per day. Not per day, 3 ounce servings at least a couple days a week. They recommend eggs a couple days a week, or 2 to 4 servings. Legumes, of course, fabulous protein source, legumes, at least 2 servings. And then minimizing, they really minimize the white processed stuff like white potatoes especially, but limiting some of those starchy carbs and limiting the red meat and processed meats. And this is really important. We see so many studies now showing that the processed meats especially are increasing inflammation and increasing risk of many diseases. And we know that red meat intake, as that goes up, we see some associations with cardiovascular disease, but we also see significant increases in cancer. So you're going to see this Mediterranean diet for really everything. All of the diseases that we talk about, we'll talk about the Mediterranean diet, because there's research in all of these different disease states with this type of a diet pattern. There's a lot of variations of Mediterranean diets, but this is the gist. This is the basics of what a Mediterranean diet is. Oh, and at the top, if you are a wine drinker, the Mediterranean diet does include moderate intakes of wine. So this is the PrettyMed website. This is an image from the website. Of course, right on the front there is a study that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. There, as I mentioned, I don't even know how many studies, maybe hundreds of studies at this point, hundreds. They're just looking at everything. And recently there was some question about the strength of some of the studies, and they went back and they had to redo some things. But even with that, they still see it didn't change any of the results. The results are still very strong for all of these different conditions. I wanted to just tell you a little bit about the PrettyMed study. Again, this was a huge landmark study. The trial included about 7,500 participants, and they were followed for, I believe, an average of about 5 years. And this was a randomized trial. So this is a randomized clinical trial. So it's not just some kind of a retrospective or epidemiological trial or study. This showed that compared to sort of a typical low-fat diet, the Mediterranean diet that's really rich and supplemented with extra virgin olive oil, and that's key, extra virgin olive oil, not just olive oil, but extra virgin olive oil and nuts, they found that it had about a 30% reduction in cardiovascular events at that 5 years. And they've showed that it didn't have to, have weight loss or anything. So the subjects weren't on any kind of calorie restriction. They were just consuming basically that model that I just showed you. And in some of the studies they've looked at high olive oil, extra virgin olive oil, or nuts. And both sides, either way, they show significant improvements and reductions in cardiovascular disease risk. So looking at that Mediterranean diet, specifically looking at cardiovascular disease risk factors, what the research has shown is that this type of a diet reduces inflammation, key. It reduces, increases adiponectin, which we've talked about being protective and reducing inflammation too, but effective to mood state, all kinds of things. Lower coagulability, so our blood flow, if it's not too sticky and too viscous, we're going to have improved blood flow, improved endothelial function, so we can help to reduce some of the negative effects with that atherosclerotic process. We see lower oxidative stress. If we have less of this, we have less of those reactive oxygen species that are interacting with things like LDL cholesterol, for example, causing damage to our vessels and what have you. We see lower concentrations of the atherogenic lipoproteins. So we lower things like those LDL cholesterol, but we also see that reduction in that oxidized LDL. So of course we reduce that oxidative stress. That's going to help with that. We reduce the actual level of the lipids. There's less chance for them to go inside of that arterial wall and go in that subendothelial space and get oxidized, right? Have less of them and less reactive oxygen species. That's a fantastic thing. The research on the Mediterranean diet also showed lower uptake of course, of that oxidized LDL by those macrophages, those Pac-Man that are gobbling it up and leading to the foam cells. So huge improvements here with this kind of a diet. And again, the two foods that have been highlighted a lot within this, of course, lots of vegetables, but that extra virgin olive oil and the nuts. And we'll talk about each research looking at each of those individual components as we move along here. I mentioned that I was going to provide some additional details on the Mediterranean diet and the specifics of what they were consuming in the studies. So what I have here, and I'll provide these to you in a folder, but we have the dietary components, the vegetables, the fruits, and the specific amounts that they were consuming. And I'm not going to go into detail with this, but you can take a look at it so that you have it. And then on the next slide, I've got how they did the scoring. So here they gave a point, basically if the person consumed the amount that was listed here in that center column, it has the amount to consume, they would get 1 point if they did that behavior. And so if you total all of this up, the max score you could get is 14. And if they were consuming, the higher the point or the higher the total, the closer that the person is sticking to that Mediterranean diet. That's it. There are a number of different approaches to different types of diet patterns. And I'm going to present a couple others that are very similar to the Mediterranean type diet pattern. And this one that I'm presenting here is the Asian dietary approach. And I think I put in a pyramid of that too. There's pyramids for everything. But this one is more of a traditional Japanese and also seen across Asia. And this particular approach is also rich, of course, in vegetables, high in fish, and low in sweets and animal foods, just like the Mediterranean diet. And the recent research in this type of a diet shows associations with reduced coronary heart disease, lower body mass index, and of course improvements in lipids as well, with lower LDL cholesterol, total cholesterol, and reduced fasting triglyceride concentrations. And a study that was published actually very recently, 2018, in the Journal of Nutrition, researchers identified a common healthy eating pattern among the Chinese. So this has actually been published very, very recently. So I mentioned that it was traditional Japanese, but we've seen other researchers looking at a lot of different Asian cultures and even Indian cultures, but they were Asian, Asians living in Indian cultures. And again, the premise of this diet, or the pattern really, is high fruits and vegetables. They do consume dairy, whole grain bread, cereals, and unsaturated fatty acid cooking oils. So here we go. Here's our pyramid. You'll see that it's pretty similar to the Mediterranean diet. Of course, it's got all the plant-based proteins and fruits and vegetables. And here comes my cat. Oh, there he goes. Okay. I wanted to point this out. This is just looking at the graphic here is coming from Old Ways. I think I've already mentioned them, but this is a great organization. I have their website there because they have so many resources that you can have for your clients. Just tons of recipes. They have lots of traditional foods for all these different cultures. So if you have clients that prefer, Latin American type of foods versus Asian foods versus Mediterranean, whatever, they've got resources for you, and they've got recipes and just lots of information. They have lots of resources for research and summarizing lots of research for professionals. So it's really a great website, and a ton of this stuff is free. But I do think on the website you can actually get some of their materials and have your own logo put on it, I think I remember that. I've never done it. I just give people the stuff with the Old Ways logos. Anyway, I'm just going to read this quote that I pulled off of their website regarding the Asian diet pyramid. Again, because there's very recent research on this. So there is growing scientific evidence to support health benefits of consuming plant-based eating patterns. The traditional Asian diet pattern features many healthful plant components, including green leafy vegetables, and other vegetables, whole fruits. That's another key word, whole fruits, not juice, whole fruits. We got to get the kids off all that juice. That they're just getting too much fructose, and it's not a great thing. Of course, half the juices aren't even real juice. They're just sweetened beverages. Of course, beans, soy, nuts, including peanuts, which is interesting. I've got some studies on nuts, and they did include peanuts. A lot of times those are sort of excluded since they're not actually, the same kind of nuts. Or they're not. Anyway, so nuts, seeds, herbs, spices, as well as low-calorie beverages such as green tea. That's one of the things that's a little bit different. They include the green tea and the red tea. We'll talk about research on green tea quite a bit because it's phenomenal. And the Asian diet pyramid is a useful tool to translate healthy Asian diet traditions into modern-day practice. And so if you've noticed, the person that wrote this quote, who is, I believe, an advisor on Old Ways, is from Harvard, so not too shabby to have on your advisory board. Now I want to start talking about the power of plants, plant power. A lot of it is due, of course, it's full of vitamins and minerals. Plants are full of vitamins and minerals, but they're also packed full of those antioxidants and phytochemicals that protect us against cardiovascular disease. So here's just some research looking at reducing the risk of cardiovascular disease. There are literally hundreds of long-term, well-controlled studies that have been published in the medical literature over the last 30 years, probably 40 years now, showing reduced risk of chronic diseases, not just heart disease, but chronic diseases in people that eat plants, that have a plant-rich diet. I'm not saying you have to be vegetarian. The Mediterranean diet is not a vegetarian diet. It includes meat and fish. It just minimizes red meat and processed meats, of course. One of the studies that was conducted out of the University of Tulane, they found that cardiovascular disease was significantly reduced, and it was actually about a 27% reduction in risk in the participants in the study that were consuming at least 3 servings of fruits and vegetables a day. 27% lower chance of having a stroke and 42% chance reduction in having deaths from a stroke. Now, granted, I'm going to talk about stroke in another lecture, but stroke is cardiovascular, and it could be an aneurysm, but it's cardiovascular disease, that plaque buildup in the arteries within the arteries of the brain. And in addition, there was a 27% death from cardiovascular disease in the patients that were consuming the 3 or more servings of fruits and vegetables per day. I mentioned a bit earlier that not all vegetarian diets are healthy, and this study actually looked at that. What they did is they created, they had thousands and thousands of subjects, and what they did is they looked at the plant-based diets, the type of plant-based diets, or if they were consuming meat, and they basically created these indices. So they had an index for what they considered to be healthy plant-based diets. That's that HPDI in your left-hand side of your graph there. So they had the PDI. So again, that's just sort of an overall plant-based diet index. Then there was healthy plant-based diet, and then they had the UPDI, which was the unhealthy plant-based diet index. And so they had less positive scores for when they ate a lot of the less healthy plants. So these would be the things like refined grains, lots of juices and sweetened beverages, and stuff like that. So those would receive lower scores, and they had reverse scores too, animal products. And anyway, so basically you're looking at that left-hand side. We see the graph is the hazard ratio for coronary heart disease, and then we have the plant-based diet indices. So you can see that the heart disease, the risk is going to go up with the less healthy intake of plants, a plant type of a diet, but with some animal proteins in there. And if you look at the healthy plant diet, so they're consuming more whole grains, fruits and vegetables, nuts, legumes, oils, teas, coffee. We're talking a lot about coffee through the course. And anyway, so we see that red line going down. We see that the risk was going down with the healthy plant-based diet, and not the unhealthy plant-based diets are not going to give us that same type of protection. So for all you vegetarians out there, please make sure you're eating a healthy plant-based diet with lots of fruits and vegetables and not refined products and tons of grains. Then on the right-hand side, you see the servings of food categories consumed per day. And so if they were consuming higher amounts of the healthy foods, you see the yellow dotted line, then the risk of coronary heart disease is going down. So that was the most effective. So in both of these graphs, what you're seeing is when they're consuming unhealthier plants and or consuming some of the animal products, the risk protection is not as great. So bottom line is, we just have to, whatever diet we're following, we just need to get rid of all the processed garbage. We just got to get rid of that processed garbage as much as we can. We're not going for perfection. We're going for most of the time, and we'll do great. But you can see on that right-hand graph, the more they were including those healthy plants, the healthier or the less risk they had for coronary heart disease. And here is a graphic, a bar graph, showing the U.S. population. Typically, this is what we see all across the globe. Most cultures are pretty similar, but we see that here in the U.S., of course, what we're getting is, or what we're not getting, we're failing to get an adequate amount of fruits and vegetables. We're not getting that minimum 5 servings of fruits and vegetables per day. In fact, only about 20% of the population, 20 to 25%, is getting that minimum. And there is a large population, I can't remember the exact statistic right now, but it's of people that are only getting 1 serving. And that includes fruits and vegetables. I mean, how can you not even eat fruit? It's good. I don't care if you hate vegetables, but how can you not eat fruit? But that's what's going on. That's what's happening. So we're not getting, obviously, the protective benefits that we need for cardiovascular disease. One of the reasons that we see so much protection from plants is because of those phytochemicals. Of course, phytochemicals are the naturally occurring compounds that are only in plants. They stimulate enzymes that help to detoxify harmful compounds within the body. They provide antioxidant protection, anti-inflammatory protection. They support the immune system. One of the things I tell my patients a lot, I try to explain why these are so beneficial from the perspective of the immune system. I tell them, think of your immune system like military, like an army. We want that army to be strong. They need to be able to recognize invaders efficiently, and they need to be able to stop those invaders efficiently. If we aren't getting adequate amounts of fruits and vegetables in the diet, this can harm our army, and we may not recognize or be able to defend against an invader. And even if we could recognize, we wouldn't maybe have the strength to defend against that invader. And we need to be able to do that. We need to have that strong immune system, obviously not just because of cardiovascular disease, but all diseases, and our mental state. We've talked about the psychoneuroimmunology. When we have immune suppression, it affects our mood state as well. And so when we look at balanced cell growth, this is really important in disease progression as well. But we see that there's something called P53 that can be offset or defective in lots of cancer patients, but we also see this in cardiovascular disease as well. And what P53 is it's called a tumor suppressor gene. Basically, if you think of the name, it suppresses the growth of tumors. It's a tumor suppressor gene. So if it's defective, that job isn't going to be done as effective. There are other tumor suppressor genes as well, but this one is defective in a lot of cancer patients specifically. So we want to be able to stop unhealthy cell growth. And if we don't have active P53, the gene's not functioning optimally, then we don't have that. And we can see some of the proliferation within some of the cells, those smooth muscle cells within the atherosclerotic disease process. And I'll give you an example, because this one is pretty simple, that I use to explain to patients a lot of time, is with some of the studies that were looking at garlic. And they added, and these were just in vitro studies, but they looked at garlic and cancer cells, and they actually found that the garlic would actually slowed the growth of the cancer cells. And with more detailed analysis, it was because it was activating that P53 gene, so it was able to do its job, and it stopped the growth of the cells, which is so important, because if we have a cell that's mutated or abnormal, we want our immune system to be able to stop it. We don't want that cell to continue to replicate. So having a healthy immune system and having healthy balanced cell growth is very, very important to our overall health and well-being. Now, of course, one of the big reasons that phytochemicals excuse me, and plants in general are so beneficial is because they provide us with antioxidants. This is just a simple image that I use I've used with students, I've used with patients. It just gets the point across pretty simply to them. So I highly recommend using something similar to this, or even this if you want. But basically we see that it really helps to get let me go backtrack. It helps to get the point across of free radicals and how they work in the body in different ways, and the need to have a lot of different types of fruits and vegetables. We want variety, and so I kind of use this to sort of set that up. But antioxidant protection, of course, if you look at the free radical, is the round ball. The antioxidant looks sort of like a little hot dog. We've got our cell and our DNA. So we see that different types of antioxidants work in the body in different ways. And some are going to work in the cytoplasm. They're going to work inside the cell more, whereas others are going to be lipid soluble, and they're going to work in, let's say, more like the cell membrane and protect the cell membrane from free radical damage. So we can see in that top circle on the right that the DNA is being protected from the free radical causing damage. The antioxidant is protecting it. Whereas in the bottom right, we see that the cell structure itself is being protected by, from the free radical. The antioxidant is protecting that cell structure. So if you think of something like vitamin E, it works in the lipid bilayer. Whereas vitamin C is water soluble, it's going to be working more in that internal part of the cell. Now, one of the other things I just try to give a visual image to people is like a water balloon. Think of a water balloon. Think of a free radical like a pin. If I was to take a pin, a stick pin, and start poking holes, if I poke a hole in that water balloon, now I might be able to patch it and take care of it. But if I start poking lots of holes in it, what's going to happen to the integrity of that balloon, that water balloon? Well, it's going to fall apart. And that's what basically is happening to our cells. If we have enough free radicals, if we have a lot of free radicals and we don't have enough antioxidants to protect it, then we're going to have lots of hole punctures, and that integrity of that cell structure is going to fall apart. And then we're going to have, the cell's going to die. Of course, enough of that cell death, then we're going to start having problems. We start having more chronic disease. We have premature aging, and so on. Now, I'm trying to think of what's the other example I use. Oh yeah, this is my other one that I use with patients and students. I use a bicycle example. When I was in college, undergrad, there was a lot of bike theft. And so you basically had to take your whole bike with you. You took your seat, you took your wheel, you took your bike, because there was such a great chance of it being stolen. Well, one of the reasons that it was being stolen, if somebody got their bike stolen, then what happened to the other person? So what did that person do? Oh, they stole somebody else's bike. Here comes my cat. He won't leave me alone today. Come here, kitty. I can't tell you how many times I've had to stop and start because of my cat today. So I'm just going to keep going. Anyway, so think about, this, basically it's this chain reaction that's occurring. So somebody gets their bike stolen. So what do? They steal somebody else's. And so what do? Oh, they steal somebody else's. And what do? They steal somebody else's. So there's this chain reaction of damage. So think of the free radical like a criminal. Think of the name radical. Radical. It's criminal. Okay. And so what does a criminal do? They steal. So we see in this bike, all these bikes being stolen. Think of that like that chain reaction of damage that's occurring. And that's what's happening to our cells, our proteins, our DNA when we have too many free radicals, is that the free radical is stealing what it doesn't have, just like the bike, stealing what it doesn't have to become stable. It's just trying to become stable. But it does it by stealing, like a thief. And if we have antioxidants, well, guess what the antioxidants do? It's kind of like the parent that buys the kid a new bike, stops the chain reaction of theft. So in the case of the free radical and antioxidant, the antioxidant freely gives that missing electron to the free radical. So it doesn't have to steal from another molecule. And so it gets what it needs. It's full. It has a full life now. And it didn't have to cause damage to do it. And so the antioxidant just gets renewed, like vitamin E and vitamin C work together and support one another, and they are able to freely give to the antioxidant, or to the free radical. Gosh, I keep twisting my words. I hope this has all come through. So we need to have an abundance of antioxidants so that they can give to the free radicals and stop that chain reaction of damage to, again, our proteins, our DNA, our cell structures. So this is a real simple explanation to give to customers, clients, patients. So vitamin C, of course, is a very powerful antioxidant. Of course, very high in things like citrus fruit. So I put that beautiful picture of oranges. And I actually have an orange tree right outside my window, which looks super yummy right now. But we know, of course, it donates that electron. So it's a reducing agent. It bodyguards those water-soluble substances. And it helps to regenerate that vitamin E for reuse, as I was mentioning, in the cells. And in addition, it helps to actually reduce that LDL oxidation. Again, as vitamin C is a great, powerful antioxidant, it helps to reduce that LDL oxidation. Again, if we do that, we can decrease that lipid formation in that atheroma, in that atherosclerotic plaque buildup. And so, of course, here are some sources of foods in addition to the citrus fruit: potatoes, tomatoes, strawberries, leafy green vegetables. If you can get your patients to eat anything, get them to eat some green leafy vegetables because they're so packed full of nutrients. Green peppers, broccoli, fortified juices, although I really recommend whole fruit versus juice. But every now and then, oh, it just tastes amazing. Fresh squeezed orange juice, so good. And one of the other things I wanted to mention is that, of course, vitamin C is vulnerable to heat and to oxygen. So fresh fruits and vegetables, those are our optimal sources, but you still want to try to eat them timely and not let them sit for too long, because you're going to get the most bang for your buck that way. And here we have an image of that vitamin E in the lipid bilayer. Again, it's a lipid-soluble antioxidant. And it protects also, like vitamin C, it helps to reduce that LDL oxidation. It also helps with decreasing blood cell adhesion. So that's a great thing. And we also see that it enhances prostacyclin 2 release. And this is one of those eicosanoids, one of those beneficial eicosanoids that's associated with reducing platelets, or platelet activity or aggregation. So that's a real positive here as well. So here, of course, are some sources, some of the plant oils. I don't recommend consuming high amounts of corn oil, soybean oil. Really, I don't recommend consuming a lot of those plant oils. I really try to get people to focus on consuming things like your olive oil. Avocado oil actually has a lot of research on it now too. Not as much as olive oil, but it's a good one, and it's got a really high smoke point. So I oftentimes will use that in cooking when I'm cooking at higher temperatures. Anyway, also strawberries. There's the leafy green vegetables. So both, we've got the strawberries and the leafy green vegetables. Okay, it's whole grains, and nuts and seeds are really great sources of vitamin E. Now, this is just a table that's looking at, again, kind of trying to drive home the message of the need for variety of fruits and vegetables, because when it comes to free radicals, we need to have, there's a lot of different types, so we need to have an abundance of antioxidants. Just being simply explained how vitamin C and vitamin E work differently in the body, we want to have a variety of antioxidants to target all these different types of free radicals. So what you see in this table across the top, we have some of the types, common types of free radicals, like your superoxide, hydroxyl, hydrogen peroxide, singlet oxygen, peroxyl, nitric oxide, and peroxynitrite. So these are all types of free radicals. And then on your left-hand column, we have sources of free radicals. So things like cigarette smoke or air pollution, car exhaust, pesticides, UV radiation, ionizing radiation, cellular metabolism, of course, just metabolism, and exercise and aging are all going to increase free radicals. Now, of course, the benefit of exercise is that it's also going to increase that endogenous, that internal antioxidant system. But we can't escape free radicals. If we are alive and breathing, we are creating free radicals. So we have to have that system in place internally, as well as the external sources to knock these things out. So if you look at this, you'll see that these different sources of free radicals are going to affect the different types of free radicals, or they're going to produce, I should say, not affect, but they're leading to the production of different types of free radicals. Poor aging, it hits all of them. So here is a table that is looking at antioxidants. Specifically, we've got a list here looking at phytochemicals, and then across the top we have those same types of free radicals that are being produced from the environment or from our internal environment. And then we can see that these different types of phytochemicals are going to help target different free radicals. Again, we want variety of fruits and vegetables, plants in general, so that we can target all of these different types of free radicals that are creating damage. So lutein zeaxanthine, high in like green leafy vegetables like spinach, for example, lycopene in tomatoes, beta carotene, alpha carotene. We're going to see those, of course, in things like your carrots, for example. You've got quercetin, and it's high in things like onions, ellagic acid in berries, hesperidine in oranges, green tea. EGCG is the primary, one of the big, it's got lots of different types of phytochemicals, but one of the main active ingredients in green tea is EGCG. Of course, rosemary, curcumin, anthocyanins that are super high in berries. And of course, you think of curcumin and rosemary like spices, right? So we see that these all target different free radicals. So if I only ate things that had lutein and zeaxanthin, I'm only going to knock out or protect against singlet oxygen and the peroxynitrite. I'm not going to target all these others. So again, we need to have that variety if we're going to have adequate protection. Antioxidants, especially vitamin E and lycopene, have been found to reduce damage to the blood vessels. Of course, we've talked about reducing that oxidative LDL because they scavenge free radicals, but they also appear to reduce inflammation. And this may actually prevent rupture of plaque, preventing the release of clots, and that will reduce the risk of the MIs and strokes. And we also see the research shows that these antioxidants can help with reducing that blood coagulation. So we talked about some of the antiplatelet effects of plants, but we see these antioxidants can help in this regard as well, and that formation of clots. So vitamin E has anticoagulant properties. This is why physicians used to recommend supplements. We don't do that. I'm not sure if I mentioned this, but they don't do that anymore because there's actually some possible risks involved with those higher doses of vitamin E that you don't get from like a multi, but the higher doses, there can be some risks. So anyway, but it does have those anticoagulant properties that prevents that excessive thickening and the clotting of the blood. So it's not so sticky. Of course, this can also be beneficial for stuff like blood pressure, because we want to have less viscous. If the blood is really viscous and sticky and thick, the heart has to work harder to get it through. So this can help also, of course, with the blood clotting properties. And here I just wanted to provide you with a table just showing some of the different types of free radicals and just categorizing them by color. So we have the blue and purple plants tend to be really high in phenolic antioxidants. Well, they do act as antioxidants, but phytochemicals, sometimes called phytonutrients. But the phenolics, flavonoids, resveratrol, anthocyanidins. Your red plants are really rich in ellagic acid, resveratrol, anthocyanidins, lycopene. So if you kind of think of just fruits and vegetables, getting berries is so powerful because they're so rich in these phytochemicals. Your yellow and orange plants tend to be rich in carotenoids because, of course, you think of your carrots, for example, hesperidine, lutein, zeaxanthin. We see that green plants are rich in catechins, which of course you think of green tea, and that's really rich in catechins. Isoflavones, which are in soy, isothiocyanates, think broccoli, the sulforaphane, same thing, and lutein and zeaxanthin in your green leafy vegetables like spinach. And then of course white plants, think of like cauliflower, which is really rich in those sulforaphanes. Allicin in garlic. I mentioned quercetin in some of the others, but if you get a variety of colors, so that's why we always tell people is shoot for the rainbow and get at least 5 servings a day. I always go back to that American Cancer Society slogan. I don't think they do this anymore. I never see it anymore, but I think it's so great, that 5 a day, the color way. It's perfect because that's exactly what we want to get through to our clients. Shoot for 5 different colors as often as you can and get 5 servings a day. Boom, you're protected. Olive oil, love olive oil. So many studies on olive oil, holy moly, it's just so protective. And when you look at a lot of the regions that have historically consumed high amounts of olive oil, of course, in the Mediterranean regions like Crete, like 40% of their calories is coming from olive oil. So almost half of their diet is coming from olive oil. It's very, very protective. Especially again, that extra virgin olive oil is what we want, and it's anti-atherogenic. It reduces inflammation. It increases or promotes metabolism of cholesterol. It reduces the ratio of total to HDL cholesterol. It improves oxidative stress markers. It helps to reduce platelets, that anti-aggregant effect. And it promotes mitochondrial function by stimulating mitochondrial biogenesis. So we increase that metabolic process, energy production. That's a good thing too. And just in general, those monounsaturated fatty acids, the MUFAs, they support healthy lipids. So things like olive oil, olives, nuts, avocados, these are all such rich rich in monounsaturated fats. And we can see with a high intake of these monounsaturated fatty acids, we see 5 to 10% reduction in LDL cholesterol, 10 to 15% reduction in triglycerides. We see the HDL cholesterol go up. So you pair that with the benefits of exercise, and that's fantastic for all these changes. Of course, we see the changes in the reduction in that oxidized LDL. We see reduced oxidation and inflammation in general. We see reduced blood pressure, reduced thrombus, and reduced coronary heart disease incidence like MIs. Reduce gene expression. So remember, turning on, turning off genes. So we reduce gene expression and these downstream metabolites that come from that increase inflammation and that atherosclerotic process. So getting those monounsaturated fats is really important. And some of the studies will give sort of a dose when you look at some of the research. Let's say from olive oil, about 50 grams, and that's about 3 to 4 tablespoons per day. So if you're cooking, you know, there's questions on if you should cook with olive oil because it has a lower smoke point. And so when you cook too long at high heat, then you can create free radicals. And you can damage the oil itself and some of the nutrient benefits of it. So I usually say if it's towards the end of cooking, I actually add olive oil into things like spaghetti sauce, and I'll add it a little bit later. And salads, of course. If you do have your breads, your whole grain breads, is dunk it in olive oil, add some seasoning to that. When I used to work in Italy a lot with the AC Milan soccer team, and so I would go out there several times a year, and I'm telling you, my God, the bread is so good, and the olive oil is so good. It's so good, so fresh. And it was so great because they would always have very fresh foods everywhere. And we would just, I mean, you would just dunk it in the olive oil, and they would have just olive oil and balsamic vinegar for salads. I mean, there wasn't ranch and Thousand Island, you know, it was olive oil and balsamic vinegar, and it was just fabulous. So good. So you want to really try to find fresh olive oil, which is there's so many products out there today. It's a little bit challenging. I'll try to post some stuff on that too. Because there's a lot of adulteration, and there's a lot of products out there that are already rancid, or they're going to be rancid by the time you actually start consuming them. The other thing you want to do with olive oil and your oils in general is keep them in the dark. Don't have them sitting out on your shelf, especially if it's a light container. You want dark container, or at least keep it put away so it doesn't get exposed to oxygen and light. And let's move on. So I love this slide. It shows this depiction of olive oil and some of the protective benefits. Of course, we see that it protects against cardiovascular disease, as I was mentioning, along with other monounsaturated fats. But we also see protection from a lot of different conditions. We see protection from breast cancer, and a lot of this research has come out of that PrettyMed study. Lots of studies. They've published lots and lots of studies. But we see that it has some risk reduction in Alzheimer's by 40%. The cancer, breast cancer, was 62% less risk. We see that it's beneficial for not weight control. I mean, a lot of the original studies weren't looking at weight, but we do see some reductions in weight. And of course, with type 2 diabetes, and part of that, of course, if we reduce weight, we can help with type 2 diabetes as well. Now I want to start talking about nuts, and nuts are just fabulous. They're full of nutrition, they're full of vitamins, they're full of minerals. They are a healthy source of, some of them are a very healthy source of omega-3 fats, the alpha-linolenic acid, or ALA, and other healthy monounsaturated fats such as oleic acid. And because they're from plants, they of course contain phytonutrients or phytochemicals. And the phytochemicals that are found in plants, of course, are going to, or found in nuts, are going to provide lots of benefits. The cool thing about nuts is that we used to always say, oh my gosh, or when I was younger, it was like, oh, don't eat nuts because they're so fattening, you know, there's so much energy. And yes, they are loaded with energy. They're high in calories because they're high in fat, which gives us more calories per gram. But they don't seem to lead to weight gain. People that eat nuts regularly, now the recommended amount is about 1 to 2 ounces or so, even just 1 ounce a day, which is what you used to get on an airplane, just that little packet, very small handful, is about, unless you have a giant hand, is about an ounce. And so the other great thing about nuts is they provide a lot of satiety. So they have a high satiety factor so that you actually fill up, you stay full a little bit longer. So I recommend for people, sprinkle them, put them in smoothies. I make smoothies all the time with nuts. My kids don't really like nuts yet. They used to. I don't know what happened. All of a sudden one day they didn't like them anymore. But I stick them in smoothies. I put them in things that they don't even know they're there. But sprinkle them in salads. I throw them in yogurts. They're just, you can put them in anything. Sprinkle them in cereal. They're fantastic in things like oatmeal. But they're great even sprinkled over vegetables like broccoli with walnuts, for example. And again, just a small amount is enough to provide a lot of cardiovascular benefits. So nuts have been shown repeatedly to reduce risk of disease. They reduce risk of disease from heart disease, stroke, diabetes. We see reduced blood pressure. We see reduced LDL cholesterol, increases in HDL cholesterol in people that consume nuts regularly. And of course, some nuts, as I mentioned, like walnuts and flax, seeds, actually some seeds too. So seeds like chia seeds, flax seeds, pumpkin seeds, those also, in addition to the walnuts, also contain omega-3 fats. So that alpha-linolenic acid, which is also very protective. Of course, the alpha-linolenic compared to fish oil, it doesn't convert to DHA as well. So when it comes to people that have more cognitive issues, I really, really recommend fish. Or a fish oil supplement to get those higher levels of DHA for brain function. Oh, one other thing I wanted to mention before I move on. I highly recommend that when choosing nuts and seeds, try to get them raw or unsalted. And that's it. That's all I wanted to say. This is a really cool study that was looking at different types of nuts, because a lot of times they look at nuts in general, but they don't break it down of what types of nuts and what kind of protection you get from different nuts. And so this is a really cool study that was published in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology, and this was very recently published. And this one was actually a study that was out of Harvard, and they were looking at the incidence of stroke, heart attack, and just cardiovascular disease in general. And what they found, of course, they looked at a ton of people, like over 200,000 people, and what they were doing is they were combining data from some really famous studies. So the Nurses' Health Study, both 1 and 2, because there's a couple of these, and then the Health Professional Follow-Up Study. And so we've got men and women in this overall analysis of this data. And so they had participants that were being followed for like 30 some years. So it's a very long evaluation of these study participants. And they found that the participants that were consuming 5 or more, so 5 or more servings of nuts every week, that actually reduced the risk of cardiovascular disease by about 14%. And there was a 20% reduction in coronary heart disease specifically. And so one of the things, as I mentioned, they were looking at heart attacks or MI. So when they looked at the specific types of nuts, they saw that walnuts 2 to 3 times a week was associated with a 19% reduction in cardiovascular disease risk. And they saw a 21% decrease in coronary heart disease risk. And then with peanuts, they saw that people that ate the peanuts twice a week, 2 or more times a week, that was associated with cardiovascular disease risk down by 13% and CHD down by 15%. And the people that were consuming other tree nuts, they found that they had a reduction of 15% for cardiovascular risk and 23% reduction for CHD. So again, eating a variety is a great thing. They all provide some kind of protection, unless of course you're allergic to them. And a lot of people do have allergies to nuts, peanuts, or tree nuts. So you have to obviously know your patient, know your client. But the researchers concluded that higher consumption of total and specific nuts had a preventive effect. There was an inverse association between total cardiovascular disease and coronary heart disease. And so in the table that I've presented here, you can actually look at some of those ratios, risk ratios or hazard ratios that for each one of the different types of nuts, and it shows the different studies. Now looking at pecans. So pecans also have a great benefit on cholesterol levels. And gosh, I'm trying to think if this is, I think this is one of my mentors, one of her studies. I've been citing it for so long, I don't know why I don't have her name on here. Dr. Rajaram, one of my favorite professors. Anyway, this study that is looking at the inclusion of pecans and looking at lipids, and so they compared it to basically the step 1 diet, which was the diet that had been at the time was recommended by the American Heart Association diet, or basically a Mediterranean type of a diet. And so what they found was that the diets that were rich in the monounsaturated fats, the pecan study, or the pecan component, because that's rich in the monounsaturated fats, they showed that the serum cholesterol was reduced, LDL cholesterol was reduced, by 10%. So, it's no little feat here. Triglycerides were reduced by a little over 11%, beyond what was seen in that step 1 diet, which was considered the heart healthy diet. And what was great though was that the HDL was increased. And if you look at the graph there, the bar graph, you can see those values, but we also see with the pecans, that there was also, not only was there the increase in a very slight, it wasn't a huge increase, but a slight increase in HDL, but there was also a decrease in the triglycerides. So I really wanted to point that out. You look to the middle of that table, you see the tag for triacylglycerol, and that again was a reduction in the triglycerides, whereas the traditional step 1 diet that was recommended by the Heart Association at that time was the triglycerides were increasing. So one of the things that we talked about before was the carbohydrate content. We really have to be careful about carbohydrate content too. So if you can displace some of the carbs, especially refined carbs, with nuts, then you may see a better effect on lipids. Now I want to present some research that was looking at not only nuts, but dark chocolate and the combination of the two, which I love. I'm so happy that my kids love dark chocolate. They actually choose it over milk chocolate. And because I just started giving it to them when they were younger, and they just didn't really seem to know the difference, I guess. I don't know. I hated it as a kid. But I love this study. It's looking at the combination of almonds plus dark chocolate. And they find reduced risk of coronary heart disease with this combination, or the nuts by themselves too. But in this study, that what they found was that the combination of about a 1/3 cup of almonds alone, or combined with a 1/4 cup of dark chocolate. And when we get dark chocolate, we usually really want that higher cocoa, about 70%. And then in addition, 2 tablespoons of cocoa. I love this. I put this in smoothies. I'll add it to coffee. I just love it. It's fantastic. Anyway, in this particular study, they found improvements in lipids. They actually found a significant reduction in that really damaging small, dense LDL cholesterol. So that was fantastic. Of course, that's a risk factor for coronary heart disease. And after the almonds only, they saw a reduction in total cholesterol by 4%, non-HDL cholesterol by 5%, and LDL cholesterol reduced by 7%, just by having something super yummy to eat. And they found that the combination of the chocolate and almond decreased apolipoprotein B by 5% compared to just sort of the average American diet. So these are some fantastic benefits. And here is a table that's looking at that study in particular. And this is from the American Heart Association. I love when they have slides for us. Percent change of serum lipids, lipoproteins, and apolipoprotein in response to 4 different diets. And so here we have the chocolate alone, we have the almonds, we have the the typical American diet, and then the chocolate and the almonds. So you see all these changes in and the improvements with the chocolate, the almond, and the chocolate plus almond groups. So looking at sort of this therapeutic lifestyle diet, this has been sort of the traditional recommendations for reducing cholesterol. So I wanted to share this with you. This is in my article too. But when you look at saturated fat, it is recommended to reduce saturated fat to 7%, particularly in people that have risk for cardiovascular disease. Polyunsaturated fats 10%, monounsaturated fats 20%, total fat anywhere between 25 and 35%. I really like going on that higher end personally because I just feel like it keeps me full longer, and you know, the satiation has just improved so much. And I used to just eat so much carbs. I mean, I ate whole grains, but I was just always hungry. And when I started increasing my fat content, it really made a big difference for me. Anyway, carbohydrates between 50 to 60%. If somebody's got metabolic syndrome, if they have high triglycerides, if they have elevated glucose or insulin resistance, I usually want them a little bit lower than that. I usually recommend it 40-45%, but you kind of have to play with the patient and see how they feel on that. But fiber, 20 to 30 grams, protein, approximately 15% of calories, cholesterol, less than 200 milligrams per day, plant stanols and sterols, we're going to talk a little bit more about those in a bit, but 2 grams per day is what's recommended, and increasing soluble fiber to, you know, specifically, they gave that recommendation of fiber in general, but 10 to 25 grams per day. So really increasing that soluble fiber, because we know soluble fiber binds to cholesterol and shuttles it out of the system. And total calories, just not too much so that we can have some energy balance. Now, this table is just looking at some specific foods and some of the cardioprotective benefits of those. So when we look at some of those soluble fibers, of course, things like apples, fruits, oats, soy, barley, legumes are rich sources of soluble fiber. We see reductions in cholesterol, we see reduced risk of myocardial infarction, we see improvements in that ratio, in those cholesterol ratios, LDL to HDL. Omega-3 fats are going to help to reduce clot formation, so that thrombus formation. They help to prevent irregular heartbeats. Research shows that they also help to lower triglycerides and HDL2. They help to reduce that blood viscosity, which of course is going to support the heart not having to work as hard to circulate the blood. We see increased vasodilation, so another plus, particularly for blood pressure, because we open up those vessels so that blood is, you know, the heart, again, it's not going to have to work quite as hard to overcome resistance. We see a decrease in those adhesion molecules that are sucking those monocytes in and leading the way for that atherosclerotic process, and of course reduce risk of an MI. Alcohol in moderation can increase HDL, prevent clot formation. Folate, vitamin B, and vitamin B12 are really important in reducing homocysteine, and homocysteine is a risk factor for cardiovascular disease, and we'll talk about that just a little bit more in a bit. And soy protein and isoflavones, or the phytonutrient or phytochemical that are found in soy, have been shown to lower cholesterol levels, raise HDL cholesterol, and improve that ratio. And then vitamin E, which we've been talking about, which of course is rich in vegetable oils, nuts, wheat germ. I try to get it a lot from nuts, but we see that it slows the progression of plaque formation, lowers the risk of an MI in people with coronary heart disease, and helps to reduce that oxidated LDL, which we've already talked about. And here's another table from my article, and it kind of just provides some more food sources for things like fiber, you know, the different types of fatty acids. The plant stanols and sterols you'll see here that we just mentioned on a couple slides ago. The plant stanols, of course, are beneficial, and there's actually what's it called, a food claim based on stanils and sterols, but I'm kind of getting ahead of myself because I know I've got a slide in here about that. But those are oftentimes in fortified foods, and some of the margarines or plant-based butter substitutes that are out there, but they're rich in the stanols and sterols. Of course, there's some sources from soy. I really highly recommend getting whole food sources of soy and not getting so many of the processed foods, because those really aren't so great for us. I mean, every now and then is okay, but really trying to stick with you know, the soybeans or like edamame and tofu and things like that versus the more processed types of foods. And then we have some other phytoestrogens from lignans, and then the sulfides that we get in things like garlic and onion. So we know that we call these functional foods because they have these components that protect us, and protect us specifically from other diseases too, but from cardiovascular disease. And one of the things I wanted to mention about dietary fiber, of course, is that not only does it support gastric distension, filling us up and helping with satiety and satiation, and helping to manage glucose and cholesterol by shuttling it out, particularly but it also helps to reduce C-reactive protein. So it helps with, it may be helping with that inflammatory response. And I won't go into this, but I just thought this was really nice, and I wanted to put it in here because I wanted to bring your attention to the National Lipid Association. They have lots of really nice materials that you can provide to your clients. And this is just a sample of eating foods rich in soluble fiber made easy. So we can give things like this to our patients and just give them some really simple ideas of how they can incorporate more of these fiber-rich foods into their diet. Here's just another table from my article that looks at some of the phytochemicals, antioxidants, functional foods that we find, the flavonoids. We've talked about all of these, but here are some more food sources of those phytochemicals. What I have listed there are types of flavonoids, the anthocyanins and the catechins, all of those we've just really talked about, but here are some of the food sources. So that's really for your own information. And foods that are just rich in potassium are really great for cardiovascular health. So, eating bananas, beans, citrus fruits, and nuts and garlic and all those good things. So again, just really getting a variety of plants is going to provide us with so much nutrition and all these functional foods that protect us. And here is another table from my article. So you better read my article. But here it's some of these functional foods and what the benefit is in terms of that LDL cholesterol disposition, oxidation, inflammation, and thrombus, and some of the foods that have been found specific to optimize those things, those categories. So we see, of course, improved cholesterol concentration with things like oats and soy and psyllium, so fiber and flaxseed. We see the reduction in that oxidative LDL with garlic, CoQ10. We're going to talk a little bit more about CoQ10. And antioxidants, rose hips, green tea. And we see improved antioxidants or increased antioxidants. CoQ10 is a fabulous, very powerful antioxidant, and it's involved in energy metabolism in that electron transport chain. It goes down with age. Vitamin C, vitamin E, beta carotene, selenium. We see that we can defend against free radicals, things like grapes, rose hips, blueberries, blackberries. So getting those dark berries is really great. And reducing inflammation, we see that omega-3 fats are important, grapes are great, blackberries, blueberries, and reducing thrombus, garlic, onions, and flaxseed. So again, it's really just the getting a variety of plants. And CoQ10 is not coming from plants, but we'll talk about that again, as I said, in a minute. Oats, as I've mentioned already, are really beneficial in helping to lower total cholesterol and LDL cholesterol in patients that have high cholesterol. And we see that just 3 grams of soluble fiber from oats per day can result in a 5 to 6 milligram per deciliter reduction. And in fact, the research is so strong with the soluble fiber from oats that there's actually a qualified health claim from the U.S. Drug and Food and Drug Administration, so the FDA, stating that soluble fiber from oats, or oat bran, I should be specific, may reduce the risk of heart disease when it's added to a diet that's low in saturated fat and cholesterol. One of the other things that we see, one of the components in oats is beta-glucan. Beta-glucan is a soluble fiber. It's not only in oats, but it's also in barley products, and it's actually credited to the lipid-lowering effects of the oatmeal. And so if you're looking at different sources of soluble fiber that are providing beta-glucan specifically. Of course, I mentioned oat bran, but it could be rolled oats, could be whole oat flour, whole grain barley, and dried milled barley, and soluble fiber from psyllium husk. And also, I wanted to give you a reference of 1 gram of soluble fiber. 1 cup of Cheerios is going to give you a gram of soluble fiber. As I said earlier, I wanted to mention psyllium. So psyllium is also, of course, an excellent source of soluble fiber, that viscous fiber, and it's been shown to reduce cholesterol, total and LDL. And this also has a qualified health claim from the FDA. And it states that psyllium seed husk, which of course is providing soluble fiber, in conjunction with a diet that's low in saturated fat and cholesterol, might reduce the risk of heart disease. And for a product to carry that claim, or a food, it has to have at least 1.7 grams of soluble fiber from that psyllium seed husk, excuse me, per serving. And then soy. There's a lot of debate on soy today. Some people are concerned about risk of cancer. You know, it kind of goes back and forth, but there is a qualified health claim from the FDA around soy protein and reduced risk of cardiovascular disease. The claim reads that 25 grams of soy protein a day as part of a diet, again, low in saturated fat and cholesterol, may reduce the risk of heart disease. Now, the FDA is actually reevaluating this claim right now because of some mixed evidence. But as it is right now, it still stands, and it is because the soy has been shown to lower total and LDL cholesterol. So phytosterols, they're often referred to, they're plant stanols and sterols. And this is basically like a group of compounds, and they're naturally occurring in plants within the cell membrane. And their shape is actually similar to cholesterol. Their chemical shape is similar to cholesterol. So when they're eaten, if there's enough of them, they actually compete with the cholesterol for absorption in the digestive system. So this is a great thing, because if they compete and there's enough of them, then we don't absorb some of the cholesterol. So we block the absorption of cholesterol, and this can help to reduce those blood cholesterol levels. And the science is very strong on these, and because it's so strong, the FDA, of course, has approved another health claim on phytosterols. And the claim reads that foods containing at least 0.65 grams per serving of vegetable oil plant sterol esters eaten twice a day with meals for a daily total intake of at least 1.3 grams as part of a diet, again, low in saturated fat and cholesterol, may reduce the risk of heart disease. Now, the National Cholesterol Education Program recommends that people with high cholesterol consume 2 grams of phytosterols each day. So a little bit different recommendation there. But, you know, it's hard to consume these just from plants. So when we look at, you know, some of the sources, sunflower seeds, safflower, sunflower, but they're also not only in vegetable oils, but in nuts, legumes, whole grains. But again, it can be challenging to get the levels that are showing improvements in cholesterol levels and reducing that risk. But there are products, as I mentioned, on the market that can increase or bump people up to those levels. Garlic. Another one of my favorites, garlic, of course, over the last several decades, the scientific research has grown and grown, and they show a lot of promise, although a lot of the trials have been criticized over the years as well. But what, there's some debate on, like, do they actually lower the LDL cholesterol? Some studies have shown that they do not lower the LDL cholesterol. And they may lower total cholesterol, but maybe not as much as was thought. But one of the things that we do see with all the phytochemicals within there and the antioxidant properties and what have you is that garlic has been shown to actually reduce that oxidation of LDL. So that's a fantastic benefit. So even if it doesn't do some of the things that the earlier study said, we do still have evidence that it reduces that process of oxidizing LDL, which of course is going to be instrumental in reducing risk. Green tea. As I mentioned, we'll talk a lot about green tea in this course, not just today, but green tea, of course, is full of phytochemicals. Particularly high in polyphenols. They are powerful antioxidants that help to protect the cells from damage, from free radical damage. And a lot of researchers have focused their attention, on the benefits of green tea, specifically the catechins that are found in the green tea. And again, the catechins are a type of the polyphenol phytochemicals. And you might have heard, and I've already mentioned in here, the EGCG. And the EGCG is oftentimes looked at as that primary active ingredient within the green tea that's responsible for a lot of the health benefits. So in the studies looking at green tea, with cholesterol, we see reductions in cholesterol. We see improvements with, looking at cancer cells and even promise with dementia. So again, we'll talk about some of these other benefits later, but it's a great thing to, instead of having that soda, switch to green tea, drink it throughout the day. A lot of the studies, it's hard to compare because the size of a cup of tea is so different, and how long it's been steeped and where it comes from. I mean, there's so many variables, but a lot of research shows about 3 cups or more a day is significantly beneficial to our health, and a lot of that is looking at the not just the heart, but the brain. Coffee. I love that there's so much research on coffee because I really, really like it. Really like it. And I'm so proud of myself because I've been able to go black. I used to put so much artificial sweetener in my coffee, and I've gotten rid of that. I don't do artificial sweeteners at all anymore. And but really in the last, I don't know, maybe the last 2 years, the last year, I've been able to make that switch to black coffee. I used to put either like an almond milk or some kind of creamer or whatever in my coffee. So I'm so happy that I've been able to give that up. But drinking up to 5 cups of coffee a day may support physiological and mental health and longevity. And, oh, my dog's barking. Sorry, guys. I'm going to keep going though. So higher coffee intake is tied to lower mortality risk, which is pretty exciting. And we also see lower risk of death in different populations, African Americans, Japanese Americans, Latino, and whites. So it's reducing risk in lots of different populations. We see inverse associations with heart disease, cancer, respiratory disease, stroke, diabetes, kidney disease. The list goes on and on and on. So coffee has a lot of potential, but we just need to make sure that we're not loading it with a bunch of sugar and creamer and all that jazz. So here's one of the studies that looks specifically at coronary artery disease. And this one found that there was a reduction in coronary disease, heart failure, atrial fibrillation. Atrial fibrillation is when the atria of the heart, those top chambers, there's a problem with the electrical activity, and they kind of just they don't get a good contraction and they kind of quiver. And I talked about that a little bit earlier, and that you can actually have a lot of problems depending on how significant it is. But the blood can end up kind of not getting all ejected, so it can start clotting, which can cause, of course, huge problems. But the coffee bean properties are what may be protective. Of course, coffee bean, it's a plant. It's a plant. So what does it have in it? Phytochemicals. So the coffee bean properties may be protecting by lowering that LDL oxidation, reducing inflammation and other inflammatory markers. And it may be that collagen acid that's the antioxidant properties within that are leading to a lot of the benefits. And just if you're looking at the graph there, we've got the low dose caffeine versus high dose caffeine. So there may be something to do with the caffeine, at least in this particular study. I wanted to spend just a little bit of time talking about beans, really legumes, but we know that legumes are associated with lower risk of all-cause mortality. They're really powerful antioxidants, and beans in general, like red beans, dried red beans, are actually ranked by the USDA as having the highest antioxidant capacity per serving compared to other foods tested. So they're really high, and red beans, red kidney beans, pinto beans, all landed in the top 3. So they're very powerful antioxidants, and not to mention they're loaded with vitamins, with minerals like folic acid and iron and zinc and magnesium, potassium. They're also a great source of protein. So if you're looking at replacing some of those processed meats especially, but also some of the even just red meat in general, every now and then having a little bit more plant protein. Beans, of course, are a great source, about 15 grams of protein per cup. And they're not going to have any of the hormones or the steroids or the antibiotics that we're seeing that can increase risk as well. So they're also full of fiber, and even kidney beans give us like 11 grams of fiber per cup. So if you have like one chili, or you can throw them in salads, and there's so many things, so many recipes we can add beans to. But one of the negatives, of course, is that they can give us lots of gas and bloating, which is one of the reasons we don't like to eat beans. And if you soak your beans, you can help to reduce that effect. So try soaking the beans in a big stock pot. You can do this overnight. So if you think of like a pound of beans, about 10 cups of boiling water, you can add and soak. And then even if you just boil the beans for like 2 to 3 minutes, and then you cover that pot, and then you just leave it overnight, as I mentioned. So just again, like 1 pound of beans, 10 cups of water, boiling 2 to 3 minutes, and sit overnight. And that process reduces those indigestible sugars that are in there that cause the gas, and it can reduce it significantly by a lot. So another solution is there are supplements that have digestive enzymes that can help to deal with the components of the beans that are causing some of the gas and bloating. We've talked a little bit about the dark blue and purple types of berries, but we know blueberries, blackberries, rose hips, they all have very high antioxidants. They're high in vitamin C, they're high in phenolic content, and they're really great at scavenging free radicals, especially superoxide. And research shows that these types of berries are really great at reducing that lipid oxidation. And some of the studies looking at blackberry extract have actually reduced that intercellular adhesion molecule 1 that we've talked about in that atherosclerotic process. And some of the mechanisms, of course, reducing inflammation, the studies are looking at one, of course, the ability to reduce those free radicals, but it's protecting that endothelium. It's protecting that inner lining of that artery wall. And in some of the studies, they've shown that the anthocyanins, the phytochemicals, or some of the phytochemicals, it's not just those, but those anthocyanins, research on those has shown that it reduces anti-inflammatory cytokines like IL-8. We see reductions in that MCP1, the adhesion molecule 1 that I just spoke about. So as we reduce that expression of those, we help to reduce that whole process. And I'm going to talk a little bit about a supplement that was developed, the company that I used to work at, that was including these ingredients and was actually found to reduce IL-1. Now I want to talk a little bit more about healthy fats. So when we look at omega-3 fatty acids, of course, a lot of the benefits we see with the heart are coming from the EPA and the DHA. One of the things that we see with the omega research is that it reduces that endothelial expression of those inflammatory markers. We see reduction in expression of the intracellular adhesion molecule 1, vascular cellular adhesion molecule, the E-selectins. We see reductions in IL-1, IL-6, tumor necrosis factor alpha. So we see reduction in a lot of these inflammatory chemicals. So getting those omega-3s is really, really beneficial in supporting cardiovascular health. And this is just a presentation of some of the very large, well-respected studies that have found improvements with omega-3 fats and reduction, or I should say risk reduction of cardiovascular disease. The Harvard Health Professionals follow-up study, we've mentioned that one earlier from a different perspective, but we see that the omega-3 fish intake helped to, was associated with a reduced risk of CHD. We see from the U.S. Physicians Health Study that one fish meal per week reduced risk compared to men that were consuming fish less than monthly. The diet and reinfarction trial, the DART study, that showed a 29% reduction in 2-year all-cause mortality in the people that were consuming fatty fish. And then a modest intake of fish, 2 to 3 days a week, may reduce mortality in men that are recovering from a heart attack. Some more studies, the SSI study, that one again also saw that the omega-3 polyunsaturated fat treatment group, but not vitamin E, significantly lowered the risk by 10 to 15%. And the Nurses Health Study, which we've mentioned a bunch of times today, this is also showing that ALA, so not just the fish oil, but that ALA of 1.1 gram was protective of a fatal ischemic heart disease. And the Lionheart Study, this is another huge trial, well-respected trial, and this one was looking at the intake of flaxseed and reducing coronary heart disease, and it reduced total deaths by 50 to 70%. So huge risk reduction, also seeing reductions in CRP, triglycerides, insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, increases in HDL. So big improvements when they consumed high amounts of flax and that ALA. I want to spend just a little time on essential fatty acids. We've talked about EPA and DHA a little bit, we've talked a little bit about arachidonic acid. So I want to kind of go through the process of where we're getting these in the diet or how they're created in the body. And I've got another image on the next slide that will show a little bit more detail about this. But when we look at that alpha-linolenic acid, that ALA, that's the long-chain fatty acids, and we're getting those from things like walnuts and soybean, flaxseed, and chia seeds are also a really rich source of ALA. And so we get the longer chain, the EPA and the DHA, the docosahexaenoic acid and the icosapentaenoic acid from fish or fish oil. And so we see this process of elongation and desaturation that leads to these from these EPA and DHA from that ALA, but the conversion is not great. That's why a lot of times we recommend fish or at least a fish oil supplement to get the EPA and DHA in higher amounts. And when we look at the omega-6 fatty acids, we get these from those vegetable oils primarily, so corn oil, safflower, sunflower, peanut oil. We recommend not getting too many of these because we see that competition. We've talked about the competition between the omega-6 and the omega-3 fats. And if we have too much omega-6, it's not healthy. And we see that goes down we see that the linoleic acid, or LA, linoleic acid, and that gets elongated, desaturated. We get this process just like with the EPA and DHA, and we create these other 20 carbon chains. And so we have the arachidonic acid I want to focus a little bit more on. We can get arachidonic acid from meats. And of course, meats are often fed corn. So we're high in the omega-6 fats in these types of foods. So here's that process, and really this is just for your own information, just to kind of see this process of this desaturating and elongating these chains. And I'm not going to get into any of that. If you're interested, you can look into it a little bit more, but for the purpose of this class, we're not going to really dive into that. But I just wanted to point out that we get different substances, these derivatives of these 20 carbon fatty acids, that are biologically active, and that's the eicosanoids. And these are really, really important. They can lead to reduced inflammation, or they can lead to increased inflammation. So when we're getting the eicosanoids from the EPA versus the arachidonic acid, we're going to see reductions in blood pressure, blood clotting, reduced inflammation, reduced pain and fever, reduced, we see reduced platelet aggregation, and reduced constriction of the vessels. So it's to our advantage to have an optimal amount of omega-3 fats coming in so that we have enough EPA so that we can lead to these beneficial eicosanoids. And arachidonic acid, on the flip side, tends to increase more of the negative effect, like increasing inflammation, increasing platelet aggregation, for example. So looking a little bit more detail at the functions of those eicosanoids from the essential fatty acids, those long chain fatty acids, we see the eicosanoids from arachidonic acid have more of a negative effect. We have prostaglandins, leukotrienes, specifically that leukotriene 4. We have the thromboxane, and what we see when we have high levels of these is actually increased inflammation, increased pain, fever, increased uterine contractions. We have the leukotrienes involved in infection and inflammation and constriction of smooth muscle airways, so not a good thing for asthmatics. And we have the thromboxanes increasing blood clotting. And so, of course, you can pick out these aspects. Not all of these are related to cardiovascular disease, but it's clear to see how consuming high amounts of meat, high amounts of omega-6 fats that we get in a lot of our processed foods are not helping us when it comes to cardiovascular disease. Whereas the eicosanoids that we get from EPA are doing basically the opposite. The prostaglandins, because there's different types, we get reduction in platelet aggregation. So the blood's not so sticky. We see the blood pressure come down, that arterial pressure decreases. We see a vasodilation, so the vessel is opening up, which of course helps with reducing that arterial pressure. We see less inflammation compared to the arachidonic acid with the type of leukotrienes that we have from the EPA. We see a different thromboxane, a different type of thromboxane, which leads to a weaker blood clotting. It doesn't mean it's absent, because we need to have clotting, but we don't want to have so much that we start to see too much thickening of the blood. I think I may have already shown this slide in one of the earlier lectures, but this is just try to reinforce that we need to change the balance between that omega-6, that ratio of omega-6 to omega-3. That Western diet is way, way too high, again, partly because of all of the vegetable oils that we consume in so many of these processed foods. We really want to get that down to at least a 3 or 4 to 1. If we can go even lower, that's fantastic. But we know that improving this ratio is associated with a lower pro-inflammatory cytokine production. So here are just some recommendations with regards to fish and omega-3 fats. If a patient doesn't have or a client doesn't have cardiovascular disease, known cardiovascular disease, just eating fish a couple days a week, 3-ounce servings, so about 6 ounces a week is optimal. Patients that have cardiovascular disease, having higher amounts, consuming approximately 1 gram of EPA and DHA, people might want to supplement to try to get to these higher levels. The reason is there is some risk with consuming too much fish because of the mercury, so we have to be really cautious. Of course, we can look to some of those sources that are lower in mercury, and I've provided some information on that already. But patients who want to lower triglycerides, even higher doses, and there are supplements that are actually prescription that are going to provide these higher doses of EPA and DHA, these higher doses to target specifically high triglycerides. Here's a table that's showing some of the research and the decrease in triglycerides, decreases in VLDL, that very low density lipoprotein, and total cholesterol. So there's significant, really significant reductions with 2 grams and 4 grams. You can look at the duration of some of these studies, anywhere between 6 to 16 weeks. But again, significant improvements in triglycerides and, of course, the total cholesterol and VLDL. But one of the things I wanted to point out, the bullet point just above the table, is that some studies have actually seen increases in LDL cholesterol. So we need to be really cautious on who would get such a treatment. And of course, a physician, these are pharmaceutical. I mean, these are not dosage that you get at the drugstore or any other, dietary supplement. These are pharmaceutical levels. And so the doctor should, of course, be aware if the patient has elevated LDL cholesterol, they might be a little bit more cautious in prescribing a high dose omega in this particular patient. Here, I just wanted to provide you with some information on omega-3 fats in food, so you can get an idea of how many milligrams you would be getting of EPA and DHA in 3 ounces of fish or mussels or oysters. But so I think this is just a really great table just for your information. So if you're telling patients, okay, you have cardiovascular disease, you want to get a higher amount, these are the fish that you want to go for to get those higher dosage levels if they don't want to take a supplement. And here is that table looking at fish recommendations. I think I put this in one of the earlier ones, but it makes sense to have it here as well. Again, the American Heart Association recommends 3 ounces of fish 2 days a week, and tuna, salmon, mackerel, herring, those are all great sources. We want to try to minimize the mercury. So those, the EWG, the Environmental Working Group, has that great website that has information on fish that are higher in mercury. And of course, pregnant children, not pregnant children, but children and pregnant women want to really be cautious of the mercury levels. And so we know that certain types of fish are going to be a lot higher in mercury. So high omega-3, low mercury, sustainable, wild salmon, sardines, mussels, rainbow trout. Limit the canned tuna in the children and the kids due to the mercury. And obviously the longer the fish lives, the long-lived fish are going to be higher in mercury because they're exposed to it for a longer period of time. Also, just a side note, the farmed catfish may have 50 to 75% lower EPA and DHA. So just be aware that if you eat catfish, if it's farmed, it's not going to have, typically not going to have as much of those long chain fats. Here's that website, the Environmental Working Group. It has such a fabulous little seafood calculator. You can punch in your weight, your age, your gender, and if you have disease, and it'll pop out some recommendations for the fish that would be better for you to choose and those that you really want to avoid. And the National Lipid Association, I love this group. Again, another one of their little slides I copied here gives ideas of adding more fish and seafood to the meals. So just simple things that we can give to our clients to get them to increase their intake. Now I wanted to talk a little bit about CoQ10. I mentioned this earlier. So coenzyme Q10 is also known as ubiquinone. It's in so many parts of the body, and particularly high in areas of the body that are really high or metabolically active, like the heart. And so it's involved in the electron transport chain. So it's involved in metabolism and energy production. And so we see that it's also protective in patients with cardiovascular disease. And we know that it decreases with age, and it decreases in people that are taking statins, so cholesterol-lowering drugs. This is where a supplement like this might come in handy. Also for blood pressure, which we'll talk about next time in the next lecture. I wanted to mention just very briefly some research that's looking at probiotics and healthy cholesterol. This is pretty early research, but it's starting to suggest that diets that are rich in probiotics may also help to reduce LDL cholesterol. And foods that are rich in prebiotics are particularly heart healthy, and they may also help to lower cholesterol. So things like your asparagus and Jerusalem artichokes, bananas, are rich in prebiotics, and the prebiotics, of course, are supporting the life of the probiotics. Probiotics feed on the prebiotics. So just another wonderful beneficial way that we can support heart health. I wanted to just briefly talk a little bit about nutritional genomics. It's basically how the nutrients are interacting with our genes or influencing our genes, turning genes on, turning genes off, so that they impact our health dramatically. Nutritional genomics is a very cool field, and I was really fortunate. The company that I worked for a few years back was involved in this, and it was really cool. So it's one of the reasons I went there, because it was really exciting. Anyway, one of the things that we see, a lot of studies are looking at populations, but we know that individuals respond differently to treatment. There are some people that they don't fall into that norm, and some of this may be due to genetic variations within the population. So recent studies and recent evidence has shown that some people with cardiovascular disease, including people that have heart attacks, is due to inherited gene variations. And so this genetic susceptibility can lead to actually more severe or earlier cardiovascular disease. And so some of these variations are susceptible to dietary intervention. So what we do with nutrition can target some of these genes specifically. And so with nutritional genomics, it's also sometimes called personalized nutrition. It uses that individual's unique genetic makeup to make dietary recommendations, nutritional recommendations, or even exercise recommendations. So some of the research that we had done at my last company, and of course others have done this as well. It's not novel anymore, but we know that some people, because of their genetic susceptibility, they actually overexpress. They have a susceptibility to overexpression of that IL-1 gene, and that's just one example. And this could lead to, of course, more severe or earlier cardiovascular disease. So the evidence now shows that people that test positive for this IL-1 risk pattern, they also have increased C-reactive protein. So when you look at studies, you could look at both of these and you could see how this dietary intervention is actually acting on that gene expression and also C-reactive protein levels. So some of the products that are out there now, or one of the products that's out there now, specifically targets IL-1 beta. It targets that specific gene, that expression of that gene, and CRP levels. And you can look at this in healthy individuals, but have that gene variation. And we find that products that have been tailored, they actually target that specific gene and reduced the expression of the IL-1 gene and also reduced C-reactive protein. Now, of course, if we can do that, we can, in effect, reduce the risk for cardiovascular disease.